Hello and a very warm welcome. So this video is a special purpose video and it is meant for a very special set of audience also. Although even if you are newcomer, you are more than welcome to go through this video. But this video is for those candidates who have cleared the IFS PAIN examination 2024 and now looking forward to face the personality test that we popularly know as the IFS interview. So in this video, in this talk, we are basically going to get introduced to what is the IFS interview going to look like and what is the basic structure of this interview, what are the core emphasis areas and what you should be doing now to prepare well for this interview. And here we are going to keep it at the level of introduction, and very soon I am going to do a detailed webinar to give you the in-depth view into the IFS interview process and what all you should be doing to do extremely well in this interview, and to give you a perspective of what do I mean by doing extremely well in the IFS interview. Let me tell you that this interview, which carries a score of 300, it is very much possible to go beyond 200 marks in IFS interview, and if you are able to get 200 or 200 plus a score for yourself in the IFS interview, it goes without saying that it will boost your candidature quite a few notches and it will keep you much ahead of your competition. And to a great extent, in the Indian Forest Service examination scheme of things, the interview can pretty well offset a little average performance in one or two papers of the main examination as well. So this is a stage where we have to put in some effort and the rewards will be more than justifying the effort and attention that you invest into it. So here we go. What are the things that we are going to discuss? First and foremost, I am going to talk about the structure of the IFS interview. Second, the key mistakes or key misconceptions about the IFS interview, and why I'm going to talk about the key misconceptions right here, because if you are free from them, it is going to help your interview preparation. But if you fall into the trap of any one of those misconceptions, and in the time and age of social media, even the misconceptions spread pretty fast. So you need to stay clear of the misconception. So that is the second thing we are going to discuss. And third is the core emphasis areas, and fourth is how to start preparing for your IFS interview. So these are the four things we are going to discuss, and this will serve as an introduction to the IFS interview process, and I will be following it up with my webinar, and you will be getting to know about my webinar as well, and a bit about the webinar and my upcoming interview guidance program will be there in the description of this video as well. Now let us start with the structure of the IFS interview. So when it comes to the structure of the IFS interview, there are a lot of things which are in common with the UPSC Civil Service Examination personality test or interview. What are those things which are in common with the personality test? So the first thing is that you are going to be interviewed by a panel of 4 to 5 board members, and this board will be chaired by a chairperson who is member of the UPSC. Okay. So this is an important information for the first timers. Those who have already faced any kind of UPSC interview would be knowing that there is no UPSC interview which is a one-on-one interview. Every interview is conducted by a panel, and the panel is invariably chaired by one of the members of the UPSC. And depending on the number of candidates who are appearing for a particular recruitment examination, the UPSC arranges for multiple boards. For example, in the civil service interview, all the members are chairing one or the other boards, and the maximum number of boards are constituted to carry out the civil service interview. But in the Indian Forest Service, a lesser number of boards are constituted because obviously the number of candidates is also lesser. So that makes sense. And each of the board will be having 4 to 5 members, mostly 5, including the chairperson. And like I said, chairperson is a member of the UPSC. Now, the 4 or 5 members who are there to interview. So except for the chairperson, all the other people will be having something to do which is relevant to the Indian Forest Service. So who are the people who will be other panelists? Other panelists include essentially academicians from the field of sciences, from the field of forestry and agriculture, and also from the field of engineering. Okay, plus serving forest officers or retired officers. Okay, so these two set of individuals will be making the panel, and the panel will be chaired by one of the members of the UPSC. Now, when you talk about the academicians, science academicians will be coming from various central universities, including Delhi University, of course. Forestry and agriculture individuals will be coming from Forest Research Institute, Dehradun, and also IARI. And from IARI, there has been a tradition of inviting the panelists who are having a larger volume of work in the field of environmental agriculture, agroforestry, and also some core areas of agriculture. The academicians from engineering side are invariably invited from the IITs, and then serving or retired Forest Service officials will be there. So these are the people. So first common thing that you are going to be interviewed by a panel, and the panel will be having this kind of constitution. So at the level of panel, the constitution of the panel will be different, but the fact is that you are going to be interviewed by a panel. Second common element is the duration of the interview. So the duration of the interview will go anywhere between 25 to 40 minutes, but most of the interviews are for less than 30 minutes. So most of the interviews are crisp, short affairs, and in these 30 minutes, you are going to face approximately about 20 questions. Many of the questions will be pretty small, pretty factual, and you will be able to answer them in less than a minute. There will be questions which will be exploring your conceptual understanding. Those questions will require you to speak for almost a minute to maximum 2 minutes, and that will be a pretty long answer. And then there will be questions which will essentially be looking for your opinion. So those questions may require you to speak again for almost 1.5 to 2 minutes. The idea is not to go on speaking, but to basically speak moderately, not too much, but convey as much as possible and convey with the greatest amount of clarity. So that is how the duration and the number of questions, and why I found it pertinent to mention the number of questions, because you need to understand that you will not be having luxury of time to go on and on about a given answer. The time will be kind of always at a premium, and you will always have to craft your answer really well. So that's the second thing that is common. The third thing that is common is that your detailed application form definitely accounts for almost 20% to 30% of your interview questions. So your DAF, the DAF that you filled up for the main examination and the DAF that you are going to fill up for the IFS interview, that will be accounting mainly the second DAF, that is the one that you are going to fill up for the IFS interview. That is going to account for almost 20 to 30% of the question, but do not forget the importance of the DAF that you filled up for the main examination as well. वो भी काफी important होगा आपके लिए. In DAF, what kind of things you share? You already know. It starts with something as basic as your name, your date of birth, your parents profession, then the place of birth, then the places you have been to during the course of your growing up, during the course of your education. Because when you write about your educational journey, the places automatically get listed with that. Then the subjects that you have studied, the subject that you have specialized in, how far did you go in your academic journey? Did it end at graduation? Did it continue at a postgraduate? Or in many cases, some of you might have gone in the direction of research and all that. Besides, have you worked ever? That will also be there in the DAF. If yes, in what role did you work, where did you work, what was your responsibilities, what were your learnings, so on. And above all, why do you want to change your job? Now, if you were already working, if it was already paying you well, why on the earth would you like to change from that to this? What is your justification for that? Why Indian Forest Service? And if you happen to be a civil service aspirant as well, which is the case in most of the candidates' journey, then why do you also want to be considered for the Forest Service? What makes you opt for Forest Service? What are the traits that you feel or you think you have which makes you an ideal candidate for the Forest Service? And if you are getting selected for both of these, hypothetically speaking, then what will be your first choice and why that would be the first choice? And this is pretty much a tricky situation. Tricky because if you say that IFS is my first choice when it is not, it will be putting you on a slippery ground, because one, when you are saying this, it will appear unreal. Second, you will have to defend it also logically rather than rhetorically. So you really need to think through. And in my interview guidance program, I'll be giving you some practical approaches how to handle those kind of questions as well. So that is one more thing. Then, of course, the extracurricular activities that you have undertaken, your hobbies, and all of these things, they will be accounting for 20 to 30% of what gets asked to you in the interview. So this is something again, which is pretty much common. There are two more common things between IFS and civil service interview. It is not a cross-examination and not even a factual viva type thing. A lot of us, we think that it will be a viva kind of thing, and where we need to know a lot of facts, maybe related to the subject that we studied in our graduation or the subject with which we appeared in the Forest Service examination, but that is actually not the case. Even if they ask you a couple of questions on the subject that you studied or on the optional subject that you took, generally these questions are the questions which can be called applied question, or which can be called as the questions which anyone who knows broadly about your subject would be curious to ask those questions to someone who has studied this subject. So beyond that, actually, you do not need to fuss much about it. But those things have to be refreshed. I totally get it, but not beyond that, at least not significantly beyond that. So it is not a factual examination. It is not a university viva kind of thing. The same goes in the civil service interview as well. And they are not going to cross-question you. Generally, we imagine in our head that when you are answering something, what if they ask this? But generally, you will notice that they ask at the most one supplementary question, and that too comes from a word or from an expression or a concept that you have mentioned in your answer. So your next question can be derived from your answer. If there is something which is really interesting that you ended up mentioning in your answer, that will trigger the next question. But this is not exactly in the format of a cross question. That is something we can very well do, keeping in mind. So that's another thing. And the fifth thing that you have to understand, that it is not an argumentative process. So neither they would argue with you, nor you should think that I'm going there to argue. This is a job interview. It is not a televised debate at prime time where you have to thump on the table and put across your views. These are very filmy things. They actually never happen in the UPSC interview room. And this is particularly important for the first timers or anyone who has not faced any UPSC interview, and that person's sole source of understanding about the UPSC interview is basically the videographed mock interviews put out by different institutions, something that we never do, and we have our reasons for not doing that. So not that, definitely. And at the same time, now there are movies in which UPSC interview is shown in one or the other scene, and that is highly dramatic, unrealistic version. Even including in the movies which got critical acclaim that they were most real depiction, but I will beg to differ there, not to go in that debate, but it is not an argumentative scenario. Okay, so you will do well keeping in mind these 5 fundamental things. And of course, the broader things that you need to be formally attired, what should you wear? We will talk a little later. Then you also need to be very careful about your choice of words. You need to be brief. You need to be clear. You need to follow those basic rules of courtesy. All of these things are given. Without that, you will not be an effective candidate for the interview. But the similarities are these. Now, moving next, if we see, now let's talk about the misconceptions. Okay, so this part we have already touched upon. And now let's talk about the misconceptions. A couple of misconceptions I have already hinted at, but let me mention the 4 core misconceptions which are there and which harm a lot of students. The first misconception is that if you prepare for CSE interview, civil service interview, that takes care of IFS interview. No, that is not the case. Civil service interview is a very different, actually more demanding process to prepare compared to the forest service interview. But even though you have put in a lot of effort in preparing for the civil service interview, if you are one of those candidates who are going to face both the interviews this year, or if you are one of the candidates who faced civil service interview last year or last to last year, and this year you have got an IFS interview call, despite that, despite having prepared for that, despite having an exposure and experience preparing for that, it is not going to be enough. You will have to prepare for this interview separately. If you are not doing that, you are kind of setting yourself for failure. Failure in this interview will be failure to get anywhere less than 50% marks. So out of 300, if you are getting 150 or below, I would say that you have grossly underperformed in the Indian Forest Service interview. So your target should be anywhere touching 200 and above, and anything above 180 is a very good score to get here, and it is a very realistic target also. So this interview needs a separate preparation, no two ways around it. Second thing, we extend our PYQ fixation here also. Okay, so well, PYQs have some utility when we are preparing for the written stage of the examination, but like the written stage, PYQ is not the panacea. Like even in written stage, previously asked questions will not be accounting for more than 50% of the question. I totally get it that even 50% of the questions, if they are coming from those topics which have already given questions in earlier years, it is actually a great resource so that you can at least predict half of the questions which are going to be asked to you. Understood. But 50% of the written examination questions are also the questions for which you will have to prepare separately. Understood? Now in the interview, generally what happens that if we get an interview call, especially for IFS interview, where the call is given to a rather limited number of students, and there is not much resource available publicly. So our next exploration takes us to transcripts. So previously selected candidates, they actually document the questions which were asked to them, and then they post it. And many of such posts are there on the internet. Many of them, they do rounds on different Telegram groups. We look at them very carefully, very seriously. But please understand that these transcripts have only indicative value. They can tell you what kind of questions can be asked. They are never going to tell you what is going to be asked. So the transcript should be gone through with an intention to see what kind of questions are going to be asked to me, rather than what question is going to be asked to me. Questions are seldom repeated even within the same year by the same board. So another pitfall that you have to avoid at all cost when you are very close to the interview, let's say your interview is after 4 days and already the UPSC has started conducting the interview. So a lot of transcript will start floating on Telegram groups. The people who face the interview on the day 1, day 2, day 3, and then we start generalizing that, okay, this board is asking this question, but this board is asking this question on that particular day and not to all the candidates which were interviewed by that particular board. You get this very straight. So going to that board 3 days later, assuming that this is what they are going to ask, will be a serious mistake to make. It is likely that a couple of questions may be asked to you, but most of the questions will be asked rather freshly brewed for you. And now, in the light of this understanding, you can easily imagine that what will be the fate of the questions which were asked 3 years back. So not even that member is going to be repeated. So where is the question of that question coming again in your interview? And if it happens, it is something which you can call as a rare coincidence. Okay. So transcripts can only tell you what kind of questions are generally asked, not what questions are asked. So that is the second thing. Third, that we need deep knowledge of optional, or we need deep knowledge of our graduation subject. So that is also a misconception to a great extent. Remove deep, first and foremost. Deep knowledge is not something which is the focus area at this stage. Whatever deep knowledge had to be tested has already been tested, and that stage was the main examination. Here, you need to know certain core concepts, applications, and those things, those themes in your subject, which can kind of attract even a lay person towards your subject. For example, let's say that if you are an aerospace or aeronautic engineer, and if someone asks you that how do you think the ISRO recently achieved that satellite docking thing? So it is not a question which would have been asked to you last year, because ISRO was not into that. Even last year, this could have been theoretically a question which could have been asked. But I can be 100% sure that nobody would have asked this question to an aerospace space or aeronautic engineer last year. But this year, it is pretty much a legitimate question. Why it's a legitimate question? Because ISRO achieved this thing this year. So obviously, this will be a good question to be asked. And why only aerospace engineer? It can be asked to any engineer. Okay. So the questions which attract even a lay person towards your subject, that is very important. Then the applications of your subject, that is very important. And then certain core concepts. I mean, it is never going to be a very much out of place question to ask an engineer, especially a mechanical engineer, about the laws of thermodynamics. And you'll be surprised, this question has been asked several times. For example, how would you describe the laws of thermodynamics? And can you tell me some of its day-to-day? And when it comes to day-to-day application, many of us start fumbling. Although there are a whole lot of day-to-day applications, but still we fumble because of the occasion, because we did not think over it ever, and so on. So these are core concepts. If you are a bioscience student and if someone asks you about genomic, or if someone asks you about climate change and so on, so these are only legitimate questions to be asked. So I would say do not focus on the deep one, focus on the practical application, the core concept, and those trivia but interesting questions. So deep knowledge is not what you have to worry about much at this stage. So that is one more misconception that a lot of candidates have got. And fourth misconception, which I have already spoken about, that this is a very factual examination. So even about hobby, we try to become encyclopedic. So let's say that your hobby is walking, jogging or something. And if this is your lived hobby, if this is a hobby that you have actually pursued, or let's say your hobby is wildlife photography, and if this is something you have actively pursued, you do not have to be a Wikipedia page on that. But that is the general response of most of the candidates that, okay, this is my hobby. So let me go through the Wikipedia page. Let me go through this source, that source, ask 10 different questions to ChatGPT or any such platform. But mind it, they are not going to ask you all of these things. If your hobby is jogging, you do not need to know about 20 great joggers of all time. If you are into jogging, they are going to ask you questions from your lived experience. If you are in wildlife photography, they will be very legitimately interested in knowing what equipment do you use. And if you are using an interchangeable lens camera, then what kind of lens, what kind of focal length, what kind of aperture will give you the best result in wildlife photography. And mind it, this is not what Wikipedia is going to give to you. Similarly, if you are interested in yoga, then you do not have to be a yoga expert. You have to basically share about your experience, what drew you in, what was it like, what were the challenges you faced, and all of these. And mind it, in everything, like the optional subject that you studied, the hobbies you pursue, in all of these things, there is always a possibility of a question: how do you think it is going to help you as a career forest official? So that is something you have to think about. Like suppose you are an electrical engineer. How having studied electrical engineer would help you in your discharge of responsibilities as a forest service official? Where exactly do you see the application of electrical engineering? Where exactly do you see the application of having studied botany, the application of having studied veterinary science and animal husbandry? Where exactly do you see the application of having chemistry, and so on and so forth? So this interlinking with your hobby, with the subject that you have taken, with the subject that you have studied in your graduation, all of these things will be very pertinent question, but not the deep factual trivial question. So I hope you have understood those 4 common misconceptions which the candidates often have about this interview. Now, the third thing is, what are the core emphasis areas? There are 6 emphasis areas in IFS interview. The first, as the name itself implies, and that is forests and forestry. And forestry becomes all the more important, I would say very important, for forestry optional students. So if you appeared in this examination having taken forestry optional, then it becomes very important. But let's for a moment think that you did not appear in this examination with forestry. Let's say that your optionals were like agriculture, engineering and mathematics, or agriculture, engineering and physics. In that case, still forestry is something that is an important area. But if forestry has been your optional, it will be very important. Apart from that, you really need to know what are the types of forests which are present in India, what is the classification of forests in our country based on the vegetational zone, then champion and set classification at a very basic level, especially if forestry has not been your chosen optional, but at least that level of awareness is required. Besides, how does the Forest Survey of India work? How often does it come up with Forest Survey report? What are the findings of the latest Forest Survey report, and how the changes have been there? What are the challenges confronting the forests in our country, and what we can do, what we are already doing to improve the forests in our country? What are the economic resources there? What are the communities which depend on the forest? What are the laws? What are the policies? What all have been the policies? What about the tribals' right? What about a new forest policy that has been formulated? Whole lot of things about forestry are to be known and must be known. So that is the single most important area where you have to work. And just by the way, in our forestry IFS interview program, we do have refresher module for core concepts of forestry. Okay. We will talk about that later in my webinar. Okay. This video is not to promote that course. So we are just focusing on the important areas. Second is wildlife. Very, very important. So wildlife, about what exactly is wildlife? What is the meaning of threatened taxa? How does IUCN classify the wild flora and fauna? Then what are the unique features of Indian wildlife? What are the important animals from the conservation point of view? What are the projects that we are running? What are the aspects of those individual projects? For example, what are we doing for Ganges and Gharial? How many different species of crocodiles do we have? Is there any particular habitat where we find all the species of crocodiles which are present in India are present in one particular habitat? What are the challenges faced by the crocodiles? What are we right now doing? Why captive breeding works for crocodile but not so much for Great Indian Bustard? And then you apply it to other species like Great Indian Bustard, vultures. How many species of vultures are there? Even if you do not know their name, but at least you need to know how many species are there, how many of them are critically endangered, how many of them are simply endangered, and are there any which are least concerned, and so on. And then all the big species like we have got lion, we have got tigers, we have got snow leopard, we have got clouded leopard, we have got normal leopard, we have got cheetah, we have got elephant, rhinoceros, whole list. And you really need to work with that. And not only that, then Wildlife Protection Act, the most recent amendment, what are the latest amendments all about? Why certain aspects of those amendments have been criticized? What are the cause of concern in general vis-a-vis the elephants and so on? So this is where you have to invest time and effort. And this is what I really enjoy teaching also once a year for interview guidance program. So that is the second part. Third part is now climate change. And do not expect the basic question about what is climate change, kaise hota hai, what are the consequences. Nobody is going to ask you these kiddie stuffs. In this, there is a lot of international politics happening. Every year when the countries of the world represented by their head of the government meet for the climate conferences, a lot of things unfold. So what all have been the progresses made since Paris until now? And then what are the stumbling blocks? What are the things which are stacked up in favor of India? What India is doing? What are the challenges India is facing? What about India's energy transition? What about India's net zero? And it opens a big area, and you actually need to break it down, and you need to work very, very diligently. Then laws, policies, institutions, treaties, practices, etc. Another extremely important. And it will of course include the international treaties, the organizations established under those international treaties, certain practices established under those treaties, and so on. And similarly, the laws in our country for variety of purposes, Environment Protection Act se lekar ke water prevention and control of pollution, air prevention and control of pollution, Forest Conservation Act, Forest Act, Wildlife Protection Act, and so on. Okay. So, and then what are the different policies, initiatives? I have not mentioned work plans, action plans, but these are important. We have to understand that. And fifth is environmental issues. And if I can say so, though like it is entirely in the hands of, look at this screen right now. And though it is entirely in the hands of the interviewer, but my experience of last more than 20 years guiding the students for forest service examination, my experience says that the order of importance is by and large this. Means the most important emphasis area is forest, not environment. So please do not pick up your environment का prelim वाला handbook और prelim वाली book and read it that मैं IFS interview की तैयारी कर रहा हूँ. No, you have to read much more about forests rather than general environmental issues. Environmental issues, they matter a lot, but not more than the issues confronting the forest and forestry. And laws, legislation, policies, law and legislation are one and the same thing, but legislations and policies and the institutions, various initiatives like National Afforestation Program, Green India Mission, I mean, how do they differ in their scope? That can be a very legitimate question, okay? Then second will be wildlife, third will be climate change, fourth will be in general about laws, policies, institutions, treaties, practices, work plans, action plans, and so on. So that's what, and then environmental issues. So इस sequence में हमें prepare करना है. So I hope you have pretty well understood कि what are the big emphasis areas. And if you want to know how much general current affair questions will play a role, I would say that they are not that important. But never commit the mistake of totally leaving it. Totally leaving it will be extremely risky. I mean, it is generally assumed that if you have come this far, you must be someone who reads his newspaper or who reads her newspaper every day and who at least absorbs the main things out of the newspaper on daily basis. So if this is the case of assumption, you have to actually meet that expectation. So general current affair, you need to know with clarity and you need to basically prepare the answer in a concise but very clear format. You cannot totally ignore it, but at the same time, it is not going to take the center stage of your interview. In most of the cases, I would say in 99% of the interviews, it is not going to take center stage. Yes, 1 or 2% interviews are always aberrations. It depends on the board, the panelist on that particular day, in that particular moment for that particular candidate. But most of the time, this is not the case. Okay. Now, where to start your preparation from? And rest we will be discussing in detail in my webinar, and I'll be shortly announcing the webinar. So where to start preparing? First thing is that get hold of a book called Forests and Forestry, a very short book by K.P. Sagaria. It is published by National Book Trust. Short book. You can finish this book in 2 days' time. And that book will give you a very good understanding of forests in India and forestry practices in India. Second thing that you should be seeing is ISFR, India State of Forest Report, the 2023 report, which was very recently brought out. Go to the Forest Survey of India website, download the executive summary and download the entire document, I would say, and focus on the executive summary. Very, very minute reading you have to give. And apart from that, what you also have to do is that you have to go to the section that is specific to your state and you have to prepare about that also. Third is pay attention to your DAF. Whatever information that you give in the DAF, that is 30% syllabus of your interview. So pay attention to everything and just try to imagine what are the legitimate questions, what are the plausible questions which can be asked from the DAF. They are going to be important. Next is wildlife, climate, and international treaties, laws, policy. Need to work a lot on this. And for the rest of the topics, that is general environment. Okay. Here, whatever you did for prelims, and I hope you were not preparing for the prelim just by relying on one book. You were integrating that one book with the current developments and all that. So, जो आपने prelim के लिए किया है, just revisit that, including the current updates. But these topics plus this topic needs to be pretty deep. Okay. So these are all deep exploration topics. Apart from that, general current affairs from whatever source that you have followed so far. Now, here is a thing about how to study these sources. So whenever you are studying these sources, always try to make very crisp, short pointers, because these short pointers will be the pointers which will give you talking point when you are answering a question. Oftentimes, what we do that we read something, we underline it, we highlight it. But when it comes to talking about it, we fumble. And we fumble because we never wrote it. When you write on paper, you are not only writing on paper, you are also writing in your brain. And when you have written something, not merely copying from a website or from a book, but when you have read something, you have processed it, and then you have written it, then it gives you a very different level of clarity, and that clarity starts showing when you are speaking. So writing, processing the information that you are reading, whether it is online reading or it is a book or it is a magazine or it is anything, it may be a compilation, but whenever you process it, whenever you condense it, and then you write it in bare minimum number of words, it gives you great clarity for oral answers also. Therefore, it will be extremely advisable that whatever the thing is, try to encapsulate it in 4 to 6 points, because a good answer in an interview is not going to be longer than 4 to 6 points, because each point will need at least 2 sentences to elaborate. Imagine answering a question in 12 sentences. If you have 6 points, then your answer is 12 sentences long, which is actually a pretty long answer. Okay. So this is where you can start preparing for your IFS interview. There are a lot of things to be discussed. I totally get it. But all of those things we cannot fit in this short video. I just wanted you to have a sense of what this interview looks like. It is my responsibility also, having served the student community for last more than 20 years. I have to share my experience with every new batch of students who are going to face this interview. So this is my 2025 update for IFS interview. And very soon, and you will get that in the description of this video also, I am going to organize a webinar, and I'll be following up the webinar with my full-fledged course on interview guidance. So all those details you will find in the description. But even if you do not attend the webinar, you do not go through the course, though I will highly recommend you do the both and in your interest. Okay. But even if you do not do either of these, this video, whatever we have discussed until now, is your starting point. And if you diligently follow through, every high score is just around the corner. It is waiting for you. Remember, what you seek is also seeking you. So goodbye and good luck, and I will see you around.